Bonjour, bonsoir.
Bonsoir,
Oui.
bonsoir, bonne nuit.
Bonsoir, bonne nuit.
No, thank you for joining. We can hear you. You are on the screen.
All right.
And
I'm gonna
yep.
share my screen just to test if this works. Do you see it?
Yes, but we don't see it full screen. If you launch your presentation, yeah, that's perfect.
And now?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, good.
Yeah, that's great. So yes, I was just introducing you. You're joining.
I missed this.
You're well, it's very short, but you're joining us from very far and very late. Thank you so much for being with us. Please welcome Guillaume Othenin-Girard, who sadly could not be here with us. Je te laisse la parole.
Merci beaucoup.
C'est bon.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm Guillaume, and I'm in Hong Kong. And first of all, I would like to thank you all for your patience in having to look at another digital person once again, instead of immersing yourself in tangible drawings and artifacts. And I would really truly love to be with you if it was not for the compulsory quarantine on the way back to Hong Kong. So I'm actually very grateful to have been able to listen to the presentation this morning. They've been very inspiring. So today I would like to share with you some of the aspects that influence my relationship with the act of drawing, and more specifically within the context of my teaching, with a particular focus on the transformative role of survey drawing in investigations of the relationship between territory, archaeology, and architecture. My encounter with archaeology started in 2018 during my time at the chair of Studio Tom Emerson at ETH, where I have initiated and conducted a pedagogical collaboration between ETH and La Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú that resulted in a room for archaeologists and kids for the Museum of Pachacamac, which is a pre-Columbian sanctuary situated south of Lima. Responding to the needs of the archaeologists, the structure was collaboratively designed and constructed by some 45 students coming from both Zurich and Lima in 3 weeks. And I insist on this temporality because we spent nearly 4 months investigating the archaeological site and its surrounding in a joint research project that produced a topological survey of the territory, the Pachacamac Atlas, as we called it. Facing such a complex and extraordinary landscape, our first act was one of immersion. We used the survey drawings both as a tool for communication with our Peruvian counterparts, but also as a means of perceiving more clearly what was already there and projecting the archaeological site into its future potential. We call this corpus of drawings, archival materials, and photograph an atlas. The atlas, understood as a survey, is an interpretive inquiry in and of itself. It presents factual evidence collected on site and in archival materials, and at the same time establishes a new reality in the form of a proposition for the future. To survey a condition is to reveal its essence, provoking a transformation that renders the first act of design. The drawing technique we used is that of the naked line. So no poche, no hatches, no fills or shadows. The consistency of the line and the fact that we work with a set of given scales allows the user or the viewer to combine or compare these different plates with one another, and therefore different physical and architectural condition with each other. While the selected visual archive documents ground the site in the continuity and in the continuities and disruptions of its past, the photographs cut a cross-section in time, restoring light and shadow. They also confer a sense of embodiment by providing a perspectival view through the superimposition of horizons that make up this stack of time and this stack of space. Each drawing evolves beyond the mere representation of a condition to become the repository of the drawer's findings. By making a survey, the drawer finds points of departure to act and take an active part in the future of a city or a territory. As such, the survey contains elements of both fact and fiction. To draw is to construct a thought and a critical gaze at a given situation. To draw a phenomenon is not just to illustrate it or repeat it, but to try meticulously to retain something, to allow it to survive, but also to alter it. I'm currently pursuing this cross-disciplinary research in the context of a new collaboration with Dr. Peter Cobb, an archaeologist at Hong Kong U, who has recently started excavating a Bronze Age fortress in the Vedi River Valley, located on the Ararat Plain in Armenia. Landscapes are changed by the perceptions of time and memory that lie hidden beneath them. They are not to be considered as a commodity available for human enterprise, nor as a set condition to be preserved, but rather as living organisms whose dynamics and movement have always been both linked to human activities and to the unpredictability of geomorphologies. The atlas seeks not only to represent the existing built structures of the archaeological sites and its vicinity, but also the contemporary reality of the wider landscape and its inhabitants, such as the recent layers of infrastructural, agrarian, industrial, and urbanization processes, as well as the ecologies and natural ecosystems that compose the environment of the Vedi River Valley. This methodology of drawing as a form of research puts forward the importance of assessing architecture through multiple scales, beyond that of the building. This approach aims at revealing the inherent capacity of the architect to think both as a maker and a territorial agent, triggering an awareness of the designer's social and environmental responsibilities in relation to past and living histories within the design process. This notion reminds us that the morphology of taskscapes, understood as the human habitat and the array of related activities resulting from it, a term that was coined by Tim Ingold in his essay, The Temporality of Landscape, have always been structured in interaction with geology, materials, and climatic forces. But the atlas looks also at the production of local crafts and industries, exploring the narrative of history through acts of making, understanding the material flow between man and the environment. The landscape itself is shown to be fundamentally temporal, as Ingold puts it, when the distinction between taskscapes, so dwelling activities, and landscape dissolves. From another complementary perspective, the poetic and pictorial dimension of landscape, long developed in Armenia as a mythological source of identity, also allows us to consider landscape as a common ground, an element of largely positive values which animates our social, cultural, domestic, and political horizons. The significance of survey drawing for architecture and archaeology is long-standing. In her essay, The Sources and Fortunes of Piranesi's Archaeological Illustrations, the archaeologist Susan Dixon showed that the multi-informational approach invented by the Roman architect in the 18th century became obsolete after his death. By multi-informational, the architect Zambelli, who quotes Dixon, intends an approach that incorporates a constellation of drawings of various scales and projection types, all assembled into one plate. I quote, "What is unfamiliar to modern eyes is the fictional space within the picture plane, created to organize these disparate elements, creating the illusion that they are all accessible simultaneously to any character that may wander into it." Archaeologists subsequently embraced site recording method deemed more rational and objective according to their eyes. But where archaeologists saw unrealistic approximations, architects instead regarded Piranesi's archaeological explorations through drawing not only as evidence of the past, but also as Pier Vittorio Aureli puts it in his essay Instauratio Ubris, I quote, as a record of the patterns of urban growth determined by the interrelation of physical factors and political forces. Piranesi did not conceive of the city as an overall plan, but as an archipelago of site-specific interventions, end of quote. Piranesi's genius resided in his ability to draw with equal care what he could see in what he had to imagine, instilling a gap for interpretation and for projection. He looked at the archaeological ruin as a point of departure for a possible future yet to come. In today's context, where most excavation recordings are done by drone, ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR scanner, and photogrammetry, drawing purely for the purpose of recording a site is redundant in archaeological fields. But within the framework of this cross-disciplinary research, Piranesi's approach can therefore be revived as a new way to apply drawing to archaeology, not as a mode of simple representation, but as a projective instrument in support of an interpretive strategy for the future of the archaeological landscape and its surrounding, which is often fraught with contradictions and tensions, torn between the desires of research and preservation on one hand and the tangibilities of present life on the other. What happened when the continuity of history gets in the way of contemporary lives? What sort of design narrative emerged from the reading of a heritage or an archaeological site that has the potential to reinforce higher cultural and social meanings? How can we as architects learn from and incorporate an archaeological approach to time, which encompasses a longue durée of both the past and the future, as opposed to typical life of merely typical building life of merely 50 years. Beyond the act of recording, the challenge facing the atlas is to construct the possible. La fabrication des possibles. Making the future implies a relationship with the past, although one cannot build the future only by means of what has been. Hence the importance of remembering oneself to the future. Or put in a slightly different way, what future can we see within the act of drawing that is capable of altering the past as a positive reflection for the present of the site and its inhabitant? I'm particularly moved by the concept of diagonal force elaborated by Hannah Arendt in her preface, The Gap Between Past and Future, where she evoked this gap, this hiatus, as, I quote, the odd in-between period which sometimes inserts itself into historical time, end of quote, allowing the thinker to stand its ground between the clashing waves of past and future. This diagonal force, whose origin is known, whose direction is determined by past and future, but whose eventual end lies in infinity, is the perfect metaphor for the activity of thought. Hannah Arendt invites us to take a diagonal trajectory that allows us to deal with the pressures of the past while avoiding being trapped by the possibilities of the future. In other words, a course that does not repeat what has been and does not suffer the pull of what will be. Perhaps the underlying will of the atlas is to draw this gap, to draw a fertile ground and inspire the desire for a diagonal act in the form of a design. Within the atlas, the act of drawing is bound to the necessity of situating history, ou la nécessité de mise en histoire, c'est-à-dire le changeant, as being constitutive of the roots and of the essence of potential projects. From then on, we admit that the fact of surveying the place or drawing it alters the situation. What we draw is this new situation, where the distance that separates us from it implies a displacement in oneself, as in space. Distance becomes a critical tool, both physically and conceptually, to reevaluate the power of drawing and drawing oneself into place. The nature of this collective experience, that is the atlas, refuses abstraction and generalization, but rather demands attention, or what François Billetter, the sinologist, calls l'observation participative. To draw attentively does not reduce the subject to a theoretical construct. To draw attentively is to measure the specificities and engage with the concrete problem that the subject faces. Drawing allows us to inhabit both our own condition, the activity of which we are made, and to project ourselves into that of others. Through this lens, constructing the drawing means constructing one's empathy and relation with the subject, triggering this self-displacement. And I apologize for the quote that is in French, but it's one that I very much, I'm quite moved by it, so I still will read it for those of you who understand it. Quand nous poursuivons l'observation, nous découvrons en outre que toutes nos capacités, toute notre puissance d'agir, voire la conscience que nous avons de nous-mêmes, comme aussi celle des choses en dehors de nous, résulte d'un même phénomène, celui de l'intégration, c'est-à-dire de la combinaison de forces qui, en s'unissant au sein de notre activité, produisent une activité qualitativement supérieure, plus intense et plus efficace. Arranged as a constellation of moments and fragments, the atlas reveals dormant affordances, local inventions, key intersections, major points of tension, all of which inform the desire to project, as well as the process and intent of design. The atlas constructs a field of possibilities, and at the same time creates the momentum of this diagonal force between past and future, which manifests itself in our power to act and results from a phenomenon of integration. And if interpretation equals integration, it presupposes that the process of building and the act of drawing merge to form an architecture of attunement, an architecture that reveals as much as we write and draws its inspiration from the intuitive relationships and invisible links arising from the superimposition of the atlas plates onto the processes of design and construction. The Pachacamac Atlas is currently exhibited in the Museum of Pachacamac, along with its ancient artifacts. And it shows how an architectural approach to archaeological interpretation can emphasize the role and the living meaning of archaeology and heritage sites in today's society. Architectural drawing and survey instruments are more than mere representation or picture. They are propositional and bear the potential to maximize the breadth of participation throughout the stage of imagining, designing, and building a vision that considers the landscape as a source of heritage in itself. Thank you very much for your attention. I stop sharing because I can't see otherwise your faces. Ah, voilà.
Bonjour et merci. We wanted to just go back on this question of integration, if you could pursue that more.
I can hear. I can hear. Yeah.
Yeah. Could you expand upon this notion of integration? Thank you. In the French quote, coming from the French quote.
With the French quote, yeah, I can put it back, or perhaps it's something because as I was working on this talk, there were very much this idea of displacement while we're drawing, or while the students are drawing and I'm drawing too. And these drawings takes a long time. I mean, obviously I also haven't shown all the iterative process that underpin this drawing. And another important fact is that they're quite, I wouldn't say rigid, but the methodology of drawing has quite some fixed parameters in order to kind of create that collective ensemble. But there are many other type of drawings that are being produced along the course of that process, which doesn't follow the rules of the naked line. And the fact of always returning to that repository of knowledge and immersing ourselves into this drawing for months, engaging also interviews, investigation with people living in sites or specialists, cultural anthropologists, etc., and translating that into the drawing. There is this movement of shifting, because not all of us are Armenian, not all of us are Peruvians. Some are, some not. And there's this middle ground where we're trying to meet while drawing. And this idea of integration, I think, comes with the time and the knowledge we construct within ourselves in the drawing. I think we're also all interested to understand what is the part of Pachacamac that is in ourselves. So there's this rocking movement, and ultimately that becomes that collective agency, that somehow the project and the proposal that emerged from that survey integrate itself within the territory, because it also rewrites the territory. But at the same time, there's this concept of borrowed landscape that suddenly sunk into ourselves. I don't know if that answers really the questions. I realized that maybe my thread of thoughts is not as clear as it could be.
I'm just going to add something. You discussed the notion of this in-between state, or the in-betweenness of,
Yes.
as discussed by Arendt. And so how does integration work with an in-between space, which is fleeting? I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, it is in between, because, you know, very often I've been engaging with extensively with two archaeological excavation sites, one being excavated for already 120 years and the other one being excavated since 2 years. So, and you see this point of view about, you know, preserving a context which actually fait fi, but completely ignore the pressure that are around it. And at the same time, the pressure that are around it, for example, in Pachacamac, you have this land invasion tensions, which means that people come at night, take space, eat the intangible heritage space, and morcel or fragment that heritage. And there's this lack of common ground or care, in the sense of sharing or disseminating the knowledge of why is it important to preserve. And basically, the director of the Museum of Pachacamac was like, archaeology only makes sense if it's a living knowledge that is shared within the surrounding living community. Otherwise, you're just depriving them from the necessity and the needs for their own life. So there's these two poles, one that really tries to protect the past, and the other one that is so busy living in the present and projecting to the future. And it becomes quite frightening is not the right word, but it stopped the motion of design intention. It's very hard to kind of imagine the field of possibles. And what moved me while rereading the preface by Arendt, where she talks about that gap between the pressure of the past and the pressure of the future, and the diagonal force that inhabit that window of time between these two stack of horizons, where the fields of possibilities open. Really, I connected it to the experience we all felt while constructing that topological survey.
Merci Guillaume. There's another question, and Carole put it in the chat. Mais Carole, tu pourrais, je pense, juste ouvrir ton micro et nous...
Oh.
Well, I can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Hello,
okay,
Carole.
so, hi. I won't put my camera. I'm not in my setup, unfortunately. So I was struck, Guillaume, well, thank you for your beautiful presentation. And I was struck by the initial landscape images you showed at the beginning. And I was wondering if you feel that drawings can only be a reduced version of landscape, unable to grasp the grandeur of what is to be drawn? Or do you find through perhaps the integration and the multidisciplinary collaboration you speak of, that drawings no longer have to capture the grandeur of the landscape, but rather can speak of certain characteristics like collective agency, for example, to emerge and take over in terms of importance? So perhaps it's no longer important to draw the landscape on a small format, but rather show other characteristics that might be as important and grand as the landscape itself.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the way we use thank you for the question. I mean, I wanted to come to Montreal, and I wanted to bring the atlas. And within this atlas, you have, of course, the drawing work. I mean, they say something on their own, but they really unfold their potential when they're placed next to one another, and then plates are intertwined, and new narratives are created by the neighboring plate. And part of the atlas is the photographic documentation that goes along with it, also made by the student, and that ties it. The photograph is tied together with the drawing according to the theme that the students investigated in particular. So this idea of grandeur or monumentality of the landscape, it's actually quite daunting when you see the complexity of it, and you say, okay, you have 5 months to somehow make sense of what that place is, and dare trying to integrate yourself to it by making something. And I think part of the atlas was this idea of working with bits and fragments that recompose somehow the scale of the landscape. But I also didn't mention that we went twice there. So on the archaeological site, both the students coming from Zurich and the students coming from Lima in Peru, which were not very familiar with the site either. So there's also this idea of embodiment and the idea of walking, literally walking the territory, gives that other experience of monumentality that you acquire by being there in person.
Thank you, Guillaume. We have to move on, but thank you so much for joining us at such a time.
I'm really grateful. So I'll join in the other Zoom now, the audience Zoom.
Oh, well, you're continuing. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay.
Ciao. Thank you.